So I have a name for two of them, two of these really deep stories. One of them is the story of the self. The other is the story of the people. All cultures have a story of the self and a story of the people. They answer the questions, who are you? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What's important in life? What's valuable? What's the purpose of life? Different cultures answer these in different ways. The story of the self answers the who are you? What is a human being? And it says, in our civilization, it basically says this. What you are is this separate being among other separate beings in a universe that's separate from you. What you are is this bubble of psychology floating around. It depends. Religion says what you really are is a soul. You're not even the flesh. You're separate from that even. You're separate from matter. You're a soul encased in flesh. Science says, well, it's more like you're a consciousness. Descartes would say that. You are this mote of consciousness inside a robot made of flesh. You are a mind inside flesh. Some science would dispense with the mind altogether and say you are just this robot made of flesh. Physics says you are a collocation of atoms, of elements interacting according to various forces. Economics, of course, says that you are an economic man, a atomic unit that interacts with other atomic units according to various forces. So they all agree on what a person is. But not every culture agreed about that. Some cultures would say that what you are is the totality of all your relationships. And they wouldn't even have a word for self that meant anything like our word for self means. They wouldn't have a word for body either. That was different from person. This myth of the separate self runs very deep. And even though I think most people kind of reject it now, and we're more attracted to the idea that we're, in some sense, we're in unity with each other, that I'm not different from you. Maybe we're even the same being looking out through different eyes, and we're not separate from other species. We're not separate from the world. We still have a lot of habits of thought and intuitions that are based on separation. This corresponds in our economic system to the externalization of costs. It says we can somehow insulate ourselves from what's going on out there because out there is not in here. Out there is not me. So there could be some tragedy. Fukushima, okay? Well, that's not going to affect me because that's over in Japan, and if the wind blows the wrong way, I can go somewhere else. And I can eat food that's imported from somewhere with no radiation. So I can escape that. The Gulf oil spill, well, I get my shrimp from the West Coast. I don't get my shrimp from the Gulf of Mexico, so that doesn't affect me. So our logic says that what happens to you doesn't matter to me. What happens to the world isn't happening to me. That's what our logic says. But our hearts disagree. This logic contradicts our felt experience. So I might as well mention that the new story of the self that we are entering, you could call it the connected self. Even that doesn't quite get at it, because that implies separate beings having connections. Really what it is the self of interbeingness, of interexistence, that understands that what's happening to the Gulf of Mexico, what's happening to children in Haiti, what's happening to child soldiers in Africa, what's happening to people living in ghettos, and what's happening to the whales, and what's happening to the forest, that's happening to me too. That's something we can feel. That's why it hurts when you see that photo of the seabird drenched in oil staggering along the shore, or when you read about children in Haiti eating dirt because they're hungry, or when I was driving from Ashland and there's those clear cuts, you can see them from the road. Like, that's painful. Why should that hurt? The logic of separation says that there's no reason for that to hurt. But as we enter this new story of self, which you could call the connected self, then it makes sense now. It makes sense why those things should hurt me, because they are happening to me.
When did you first hear about Cascadia, and how did you hear about it?
Oh, this goes back a long way. I read Ecotopia. So that would have been maybe 1984, 83. So I don't know even know when that came out. But I think that the idea was really thrilling, just that people could secede from a gigantic beast like the United States and try to take back some measure of democratic decision-making. It was clear to me since I was very young that we did not have a real democracy in this country, that the whole thing was kind of a joke. But the idea that people could do that, and I think the stories are really important because we're storytelling creatures. And until somebody gives you the narrative, it's really hard for most of us to live it. But having the story out there that a group of people actually did this, I just found that really, it just broke a whole bunch of things open for me.
It seems like we are living in a story that doesn't match physical reality and are therefore coming into problems with physical reality. How do we find the ability to live symbiotically? Do we need a story that tells us this, or can we get rid of all stories and just sort of see the hard facts and come to terms with that? A little bit of both.
Oh boy. Stories are powerful. I mean, stories shape the way we see the world. Whether they're sort of classic stories, sacred stories, urban myths. I mean, stories shape the way that we really see things, and therefore, I think, how we behave in many ways. And sometimes we're not very good at really acknowledging facts or recognizing facts. And one need point no further than simple political discourse today to recognize sort of how little facts may actually play into argumentation.
I think that civilization wasn't necessarily spawned or continued through religion, but that religion was an expression of our deeper mythology. If we can change our mythology, then the religion and all these other aspects of culture are sort of organically grown out of that. So it's more about getting to the layers underneath the religion and finding, what are our myths that make us believe certain things and what are the myths that make us believe other things. One of the aspects of reclaiming our spirituality and changing that mythology is learning from indigenous cultures that exist and how they perceive the world, and then we can compare our set of myths next to theirs and recognize why maybe we're doing certain things that are destructive and they didn't.
I learned from my teachers, my elders, my family, my relatives from other communities, the elders, the knowledge keepers. I learned from them in a way that they don't mark me, they don't test me, they don't, they tell me stories. And then I have to find the value in those stories. What are you really trying to say, right? Like when they say, when I was fishing, the trees were always over the river and we had to crawl under them and the river went back and forth and it created all these different pools where the fish were at, and that's where we fished. They're describing what the natural habitat looked like. They're telling us about the temperature of the water, where the fish like to be in certain depths of the water, where the pools, what they look like.
One of the things I've found in writing the books that I've written are that if you look at the history of things, and there's enough records, people are good at taking records. They're fragmentary, they're rich, depending on the context. But if you look back at issues through a historical context, it can frame the story, maybe even give you a new story or a new way to think about the story we're living through today, which will be tomorrow's story.
What I'm saying is, it's about how do we interpret that and transfer that knowledge so that it's applicable anywhere.
I started out freelance writing for a commercial fishing magazine right out of college, and just slowly over time realized that I wanted to take on a big project. So back in 2007, sort of hatched this idea that I wanted to write about dam removal, because what I had seen starting out writing for this commercial fishing magazine was that suddenly these sort of rough and tumble blue-collar guys who made their living on the oceans were becoming very much concerned, and not only concerned but active with what was happening upstream in places where the fish that furnished them with their living were spent important portions of their lives, the beginning and end of their lives. And I just thought that was a very intriguing story, to have these guys that lived in Astoria and Reedsport and Newport being engaged with what was happening in Idaho and Lewiston and the Dalles, and aligning themselves, however uncomfortably, with some of the environmental groups that have been pushing these issues. You know, this is a relationship that scares the hell out of a lot of captains of industry when working people and community environmental activists start talking to one another. And I think that's a story that's still unfolding.
Yes, it is the first time I've been asked to speak about Cascadia. I think that that is something that's missing pretty deeply. It needs to be something that's just in everybody's mind all the time, so that this could actually become more possible. I think until we actually imagine it, it's not going to be possible. And until those of us who understand how this could happen and why it's necessary, we need to be bringing that forward at every opportunity so that it becomes more possible for sort of regular people to start identifying with their land base, to start understanding that this country's way too big. We're never going to have real democratic decision-making in a country that's got 300 million people. I mean, you just can't have a voice as a single person when it's that big, and when you can't know your neighbors. So it's got to be smaller. For so many reasons, but even just for our decision making, it's got to be smaller. So,
you know, I grew up in kind of a working class neighborhood, so that's sort of an unfolding tale that I attached myself to, and now it's become a topic of mainstream discussion. Politically, the odds are still long, but I think that's the case for every dam removal at the outset. So, you know, stay tuned. It's a story that's not over by a long shot.
What's more important is changing the mythology that we have that makes civilization continue. Obviously, one aspect of that mythology is the fundamentalism. And so that aspect has been expressed in all these different religions who believe they have the one right religion.
I think it can be a lot easier for people to essentially try and come to grips with facts through history than through politics today, because people filter based on sort of what they want the outcome to be today. But the past has happened. You know, it's a story that's been told. Now, it can be spun, it can be retold, there's lots of ways to deal with the past. But I'm of a firm conviction, perhaps because I'm a geologist, and geology is a historical science, sort of the history of the Earth sort of shapes the trajectory of the story today. And perhaps because I sort of would like to think that in looking at the history of humanity's interaction with the land through whether it's fish, whether it's soil, whether it's how to accommodate, you know, more people on the planet, that looking at that history gives us a way to shape and frame the context without immediately retreating to our political corners and trying to argue from belief rather than knowledge. And if there's one thing I'm pretty certain about, it's that the problems that we face in this upcoming century are ones that would be far better off trying to grapple with from a knowledge-rich basis than from a belief-rich basis. Because it is literally, we're running into the limits of what the world can support. And as we do so, we're going to be our descendants will be a lot better off if we deal with it openly, honestly, and sort of, you know, embracing ideas, whether from left, right, or center of the political spectrum, but that which actually track with the way the world works.
So traditionally, you know, there's a lot of stories here in this specific area, but as you travel further north and south and deeper inland, there's a lot of similar stories pertaining to floods. And here in our territory, we have flood stories that go back 2 or 3 floods. And so this was a recurring type of a natural disaster or an event that would occur from time to time. And the common link with a lot of the different flood stories is the fact that there is a person or a group of people within respective nations that become aware of the fact that there's a flood that is going to occur. And in most of these stories, that person or group of people try to raise the alarm bells and let other people know that, that there's some type of impending doom or change or shift that is about to occur. And in almost all stories, there's just a small faction of people that are fully aware of what is about to happen. Not necessarily the reasoning behind it or what the repercussions of it are going to be, but that a great shift or change is about to occur. And of course, there's many other people who are metaphorically washed away in this flood that occurs.
You know, politicians and sort of people that shape public opinion have known for a long time that the mass of people are looking for a narrative to kind of attach their existence to, and that's a difficult thing these days because we live in an age where our attention is divided by work, by the sort of endless array of electronic and internet devices, by family, by our attention span has been fractured.
I wish it was as simple as rewriting our story. I wish that becoming revolutionaries and building a revolutionary movement was as simple as writing a story and then living by it. But I don't think it is that simple. I think it is more complicated. Because I think, we have stories. We have everything from ecotopia, to the literature that has sparked the DGR movement. We have a lot of books talking about this area and this region, but I think that to really become revolutionary, we actually have to start doing the work. We have to buckle down and get our comrades close and say, let's get to work. We need stories to help us make sense of what we're doing and to give us, kind of a storyline to move forward with. But what also needs to be there is a willingness to make sacrifices and a willingness to do the hard work. And I don't see a whole bunch of that these days, especially in the United States. But it is growing. It is growing. So I don't know if that was.
Anyway, yeah, I think it's kind of a failure that everything sort of collapsed and nobody talks about it much anymore. Because it's going to be absolutely necessary. Whether we want it to happen or not, it's going to happen. Empires don't last. This one's on its last legs. So we need to start preparing for what comes next. And so ideas about secession or, bioregional government, decision-making processes and, local economies and all that's going to have to come to the fore if we've got any chance of really surviving as a decent society in any way.
My sister is pretty right-wing, and when Obama was first elected, we both agreed for different reasons that we thought Obama might be the last president of the United States. She thought that was the case because he's a communist, socialist dictator who's going to seize power and force Obamacare onto everybody. And I thought there's a good chance he's going to be the last president of the United States because I'm not sure the United States is going to go much longer before it collapses. And I used to be really afraid that as the system collapses, that those of us who resist the culture would all be killed or put into prison camps or something, but more and more I'm thinking it might be kind of like the collapse of the Soviet Union, where they simply can't deliver the mail and they're not able to repress because they can't even keep the roads maintained.
Well, the problem here is that you have the spoken values, so the values that people like to uphold as the American tradition, and then you've got the real values that people are actually living. And there's such a gap between them that I don't know which to address. So, the actual values of this culture, that this constitution, that the economic system, that all of that is founded on is really just about exploitation. The merchant barons who wrote the Constitution, they saw this vast continent and they wanted to gut it. They wanted to turn it into, take living communities, turn them into private property, and then into dead commodities, and then into private wealth. And they've done that. It was a very successful document. That's what it was intended to do, and that's what it's done. So those are really the values that this country was founded on. Then you've got the values that people like to uphold as somehow being, what America really is, and that would be things like freedom or tolerance or, your right to your own religion, your right to free speech, your right to petition the government. Those are all good things, but we don't actually have those in this country. So there's a gap here for me in terms of, if I think that Cascadia has to be against the real values that this country was founded on, clearly. Especially if you're going to save that last redwood, you're going to have to stop them from gutting the forest, right? But in terms of the values that I think a lot of people equate with, their sort of romanticized version of the United States, I don't think that there should be that much of a disjuncture, because if people really do care about things like freedom and democracy, that can only happen on a local and regional level. So the only way people are really going to experience that and make that real in their lives is by taking control again of the local and the regional, sort of that scale of human arrangement.
You can't eat money, you can't drink money, but we do need to pull together and figure out how we're going to live here. And I think there's still some real differences in what people believe, how to do that on the entire earth. Not just in our area, but around the world. You see the devastation, like that Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans. People were killing each other for a bottle of water. Why do we have to wait for it to come to that? We don't. But that's a stark reality. And when it's you or me, that creates conflict, and it's unavoidable when it's in peril.
All of your basic necessities have got to come from the place in which you live. And right away, why can't we be supported by the places that we live? Well, it's because they've been destroyed. There should be millions of salmon in these rivers, and there's none, really. They're almost all gone. Same with the oceans. Here we are a mile from the ocean. Why are the oceans empty? They are empty. The plankton populations are collapsing. That's how bad it is in the oceans. So right away, if you try to live from the place in which you're actually situated, you start to see that it's been destroyed and that it's still being destroyed. And so what are the forces that we're up against? And it's these vast industrial capitalist industries. So industrial logging, industrial fishing, industrial agriculture, that's what's destroying this place. So in order to stop it, we're going to have to confront all that and just dismantle it in some way. And again, we can have conversations about how that might be done, but the basic fact is that we are going to have to do it.
Bioregionalism is the only way of living that can ever be sustainable. In Endgame, I talk about how civilization is not and can never be sustainable, and then I define civilization as a way of life characterized by the growth of cities. I define a city as people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources. And what this means, the Tolowa, who lived here for at least 12,500 years, were not civilized. They didn't live in cities, they lived in villages, camps. They didn't require the importation of resources. And two things happen as soon as you require the importation of resources. One is that your way of living can never be sustainable, because if you require the importation of resources, it means you've denuded the landscape of that particular resource. And as your city grows, you'll denude an ever larger area. And the other thing it means is your way of life must be based on violence, because if you require the importation of resources, then that means that trade will never be sufficiently reliable, because if you require the importation of resources and the people in the next watershed over won't trade you for that resource, you're going to take it because you need it. And that means we can all have these voluntary transformations to becoming junior bodhisattvas, and the US military would still have to be huge, because how else are they going to get access to the oil they need to run the economy?
How do we confront the violence implicit in the industrial economy? I think that even the recognition that the violence is implicit in it is really important, because at one time maybe we thought that the industrial economy is maybe neutral or even a good thing, and that the violence is coming from somewhere else, maybe ourselves, maybe we're bad, and it's just a matter of re-engineering the system so that it is no longer violent. But I think we're understanding now that the violence is built in, like you say, and to, ultimately that system is built on our way of being in the world and our basic myths, the stories that define our culture. And to confront that requires work on every level, not just on the political level, but on the community level, family level, interpersonal level, and the inner level. And I think, when you say, how do we confront that? Who is this we? Different people have different gifts and are drawn to different applications of those gifts. So for some people, that question might be very personal, and examining yourself to see how do these industrial mindsets manifest in my own consciousness.
As long as we still have faith in the legislative bureaucracies of Washington, D.C., or Ottawa, or whatever nation state we are in, I think we're going to be fooling ourselves that a broken system can work, or not even a broken system, a system that's set up to exploit the earth and maximize production, which is a euphemism for the turning of living communities into dead commodities. So until we start to, take legitimacy away, in our minds from the governments of nation states and capitalist economies, exploitative economies all over the world, and shift that legitimacy into our own backyards, into our own communities and land bases. Until we start doing that, we're going to keep fighting the uphill battles.
One of the things that John Osborne has said, and that I've quoted for years, is that a lot of environmentalists begin by wanting to protect a specific piece of ground and end up questioning the foundations of Western civilization. And the reason is because they start asking, why is this land being destroyed? And then if they ask, why is this land being destroyed? They start asking, why does land get destroyed? And then they start asking, well, why do you have an entire system that is based on destroying land? And then they start asking, how has this system lasted so long? And they start asking all those questions. And the thing I don't understand about people like Lester Brown or Bill McKibben or Peter Montague, as brilliant as they are in their ways, is how they stop the questions. I don't understand how you can recognize that global warming is killing the planet, and that recognize that civilization, the stuff I say is not particularly cognitively challenging. I don't understand why those mainstream, or Al Gore, for crying out loud, he did the whole, inconvenient truth. I don't understand how they could stop asking the questions.
Okay, so right now when people talk about the real world, they're talking about the economy most of the time. They mean jobs, wage jobs. And the economy is seen as the grand kind of overarching thing that everyone should be concerned about. If you look in the newspaper, there's a whole section, all the economic indicators are up there. And then society is really treated like a subset of the economy. If you want to make social change, people ask, well, how will that affect the economy? And ecology is treated as an even smaller subset within that. So people only care about the environment, often to the extent that it affects, their personal lives. And because they're living inside of industrial society, that's often not very much. Traditional societies, sustainable societies, often look at it the opposite way. So ecology is what we all live in. We depend on the land base. We need the land base to survive, and that provides everything else. And then society, our society is inside that, is encapsulated by that. And then within society is the economy. And there are rules that the economy has to follow that are set by the community. The community places limits on the economy. So the way that society is structured right now, the way that people view the world, is really an inversion of what you would want to see if you were actually living in a sustainable society. Instead of the ecology being the basic necessity, kind of the starting point for our philosophies or our worldviews or our discussion, it's been inverted to the economy. And of course, that's been a complete disaster ecologically. I mean, even from, human or social terms, it's been pretty disastrous. And most people aren't aware of that. They don't think about that. They don't think about ecological crises because they're not living in an ecological world. They're living in an artificial world, a bubble, a construct, a spectacle. And so they aren't even aware of the level of crisis that we're in, let alone able to actually think about why we're in a crisis and how we need to respond to that if we're going to be successful.
Things have developed to this point for a reason. It wasn't just a big mistake, and we're not the victims of some conscious conspiracy or just some evil set of evil power elite or something like that. We've tried that before. We've tried to destroy those in power, but the way that happens, the types of organizations that you need to create to do that, the types of ideologies you need to create to do that, those end up replicating the same power structures, maybe in a slightly different form. So the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, was one of the few revolutions that was actually successful in tearing down the original 1%, but they just installed a new 1% because the underlying mindset is the same, which basically comes down to control. And this again taps into our basic ideologies, for example, of science, that the way that we're kind of in opposition to nature, at the mercy of these natural forces, but we've developed more and more technology to control nature. And that also extends to controlling human nature, to controlling society, to controlling the evil part. The locusts, the floods, the rats, and now the bad people. And the ideology says that goodness comes through control. But I think that control is fundamental to the problem.
Being occupied and being occupiers as opposed to inhabitors is so deeply entrenched, it goes to our very epistemology. I talk about this in Dreams, that Richard Dawkins says that science bases its claims to truth on its spectacular ability to make matter and energy jump through hoops on command, and to predict what will happen and when. And that's really true. I mean, we've got lights here, we've got these cameras. You know that if you push a button, then the camera's gonna work. And if we turn on the lights, they're gonna work. And that's so we know that that's true in one sense. But also he's done something very sneaky there, which is he has conflated how we know with domination. He's actually saying that we know something is true because we can dominate. And think about this, though, that if I had a gun and I put the gun on you and I have a hoop and I say on the count of 3 you're going to jump through this hoop, and then on the count of 3 you do it because I got a gun and I'm going to shoot you if you don't, what do you know? I'm a genius because I just predicted you jump through a hoop and then you did. But on the other hand, have I not perhaps permanently foreclosed any possibility of friendship with you by putting a gun on you and forcing you to jump through a hoop on command. And for me, that gets to the essence of the difference between occupying and inhabiting, that what this entire culture from top to bottom, inside out, is based on is making everybody else jump through hoops on command. Making the salmon jump through hoops on command, managing the salmon. I'm sorry, they managed themselves fine for long before we started. And in fact, they're not doing fine now that they're being managed.
When we talk about the patriarch, which is a very sensitive topic for people, especially I find amongst men who really do believe that they're making a change, it's bigger than just recognizing a power structure imbalance in our day-to-day working lives in terms of equality. It's sort of needing to see an overruling mentality that is really becoming destructive. Anything in excess can become destructive. And so it's seeing where yang principles, yang qualities have become destructive in the overall harmony, and being able to voice that. And first you have to claim that in your own lives, in your own relationship with yourself, and how you allow your own intuitive energy to come through, how you justify that, your relationship to your emotions, how you process those, to control. That's all within yourself. And then you go into your relationships with other men, with other women, your working worlds, political structures, and then we got war going on. So it's really big. And the more that we can see that there is an unbalance in terms of we're not using our full capacities to problem solve, the more we can learn how to use our full capacities to problem solve.
Many people like to think from a human perspective that we're a being that is intent on control and domination, not only of each other, but of the natural world. And I think that's kind of in many instances, a real general, deep-seated or innate feeling. But, in reality, it's not that way.
One of the ways that civilization maintains its control over people is by removing us from our understanding of our connectedness to the bioregion and making us instead connect with the idea of the state or nationalism. And what that does is it takes us out of physical reality and gives us more or less a fictional story to live in instead of the physical reality. And bioregionalism is a way of kind of destroying that nationalism myth and bringing us back to the land and making us understand what it means to actually live on the planet.
In my generation, we can't drink water out of the streams like we could before in previous generations. There are still some springs, if you know where they are, they're drink away. But it's not safe to eat all the foods we used to eat if they come off of a nuclear reservation. If nuclear plumes are headed for the waterways, then underground plumes, then what's going to be safe to eat out of the river? So in the next 3 generations, we have to prevent as much desecration from happening as we can. And that's not small change, that's big change. My uncle used to tell me that you can't turn a carrier, a naval aircraft carrier, on a dime. Well, you can't turn, with 2,000 people on that ship, you can't turn it around fast. Well, this isn't going to happen quickly. It's going to happen over the course of the next 3 or 4 generations. It's not going to be your generation. You're going to start it, perhaps, or perhaps our generation started it and you're picking up the mantle now. But our Indian people have been worried about it for quite a while. Because in part, the people who came here thought that man knew best. So, not taking teachings from other species who live here about how to live. When man is omnipotent and knows all and thinks all and sees all and does all, there's a huge danger in that. There's a huge risk that we don't. And we could screw ourselves out of a future because we are not the only influential factor.
What we really try to focus more upon is the human aspect of, the spirit of the land, and going beyond that it's not only human beings who inhabit this land, but it's many spiritual beings, many different beings that share life and are nourished or nurtured from this land. And so our traditional beliefs focus more upon the fact that we as human beings are just one part of the whole living system that makes up this area. And the challenge that we're experiencing today is sharing that belief and that philosophy and that way of life with mainstream society.
In particular, in this time, is very male-dominant within its views and mentalities. And when I say male-dominant, it's what culture has decided to be male. It's not necessarily what overall is the role of man. But it's very logistical. It's very calculated. Everything can be studied and be known and be verified as truth. And there's a specific format for everything. Whereas in the world of the feminine, everything is really kept inside and kept unseen. And a lot of it is unknown. If you think of even pregnancy, there's this period of time where there's a great mystery and you have a hinting of it emerging, but there's so much happening that you do not see. And the allowance of not knowing in our culture is very, very small room for that. And in that takes away our ability to adapt to what's happening and brings about a need for control. And control again brings us into dominates and power struggles, and that spirals out. And so bringing back in the idea and the acceptance of something being unknown, and that is its pure state, and that is also a gift, as much as it is to know, can really help to bring some balance. To be able to say we don't know the answer, and that's okay. We're still going to go forth with what we can do, and bringing back in a trust of something bigger than us again. Because there's a lot of belief that we control everything, that we even control the fate of the planet right now. And even at that, our actions have direct cause and effect, but there's still something so much bigger than us at work.
Like many people in my teenage years, I had a pretty strong sense that the world isn't supposed to be this way. That the normal that had been offered to me just wasn't good enough. Not good enough for me, and really not good enough for anybody. And most people, I think most kids have this sense on some deep level, this kind of muted protest that comes out in various forms of rebellion. But that feeling usually doesn't have any allies, or doesn't have very many allies. All the voices around you are telling you, no, the world is the way it's supposed to be, and you better adapt to it and be a good boy and get used to it.
That whole ability to even conceive of a way through this is being taken away from you, so that your true essence, your true Christ essence will be expressed in a way that helps you love where you are, so that the way that you go forward is in an energy of love and gratitude and acceptance. We have focused so much on how the whole patriarchal sense of wanting to know, as we say, anything, to limit everything, to put everything into a box of empirical knowledge. The whole impetus towards empiricism is one which is based on a fear of the unknown. If we can't define it, if we can't measure it, if we can't weigh it, we don't know what it is. And yet we're finding through science more and more and more these things that we cannot measure.
When I talk about land, it includes water, plants, birds, animals. It's not just dirt where I stand. it's everything around me. It's the environment. It's the ecosystem. It's the things that are connected to not just this place, but everything that influences this place.
This region has a symbolism of being the edge of civilization, that final last stand of trees, of old growth trees, and saying basically, no, we will not have that last stand cut. It is, in some sense, maybe that's the really good way of defining Cascadian, is its defiance. It is that struggle against what we've been escaping from. I mean, if you look at the pioneer diaries, the journals of the pioneers that came here, a lot of them talked about just the beauty of this place and how they were escaping, civilization. Cascadia, in some sense, is that escape from civilization, and civilization not being something that's, we always think of civilization as something like being nice, but it's also dirty. It's also totally against nature. Not to say that Cascadians are not city-based people, some of them are, but even how we look at our cities is completely different.
All it took was a couple of trips outside the Pacific Northwest for me to realize that this place has a lot of beauty, and the land here kind of forces you to pay attention to it. And there's always been something about the air to me here. It's just unlike any other air that I've ever breathed.
I would think of it as a living organism, as one giant cell, and it is a living thing. It breathes. It requires movement. It requires shifting, and it requires all of that. And we know that regions are living organisms, and we see what happens when those regions are disrupted. Let's take, for example, Japan. The tsunami comes in. That's a living system. That system of the water has spilled over and is alive, and it moves, and it has a spirit, and it completely takes over the area. When a tornado comes through and it completely collapses buildings and structures, and it gently comes, and I say gently even though it's very violent, that is a living system. So if that isn't evidence that the land is a living entity, I don't know what is. In terms of getting individuals to understand that, understanding that is critical to our survival.
Europeans and Americans, meaning people on the East Coast or the Midwest, when they look at stories like Little Red Riding Hood or Hansel and Gretel, the forest is always seen as a place that is scary, Sleepy Hollow for the American iconography. The big bad wolf. Nature is something that they're running from. Whereas people who came here tend to run to nature. Nature is salvation. Nature is that last refuge. It is that sanctuary that we're trying to get to. Being in nature is our rejuvenation, removing those scars of civilization itself.
I think we have a higher regard in this area in general for the forests and for the salmon, for the grizzly bears. And that's because we still have populations of wild salmon. Unlike the East Coast, we still have grizzly bears. We still have cougars, which are gone from half the continent. We still have some old growth forests. And so I think that has, the fact of the existence of these creatures, these other beings, has, they're powerful. They're full of spirit and power. And I think some of that has leaked out into the culture here. And it's only around the edges. I think the mainstream culture here in Cascadia is the same mainstream culture that you'd find in Tokyo or in Shanghai or in Paris or in London or in Johannesburg, anywhere around the world, which is a culture of materialism, of consumption, a culture of obsession, a culture of addiction, a culture of xenophobia, a culture of narcissism, a culture of entitlement. And unfortunately, that's the mainstream culture here as well. But I think there are some cracks in that facade here that you just don't see as much when you go to places like Boston or New York City.
So I completely agree that the problems are unconscious. Luis Rodriguez is a former gang member who got out through the literature of revolution. I asked him one time, why so many gang members shoot each other? I mean, why don't they just shoot capitalists? Why are they shooting mirror images of themselves? He says there's a couple reasons. One is the cops set them against each other. But another reason is that they're shooting at mirror images of themselves because they want to die. And the reason they want to die is because they're teenagers. And teenagers are supposed to want to die because a teenager has to die as a child to become an adult. But what they don't know, because no one is telling them, is this death is supposed to be spiritual and metaphorical. And so there's supposed to be a ritual death of the child, and then the adult emerges. All healthy cultures have this. But once again, nobody's telling them this. So they have this, they know, I want to die, but they don't know because nobody's telling them that doesn't mean you're supposed to strap up and lay waste to everybody. And I think that there's a lot the same with this culture. This culture, there's a deep level which we recognize it's so miserable, and we want it to end, but we don't recognize that this end can be spiritual and metaphorical. And so the planet's getting killed. That's part of the reason. Another part of the problem is that within this patriarchy, one becomes masculine by defining someone else as inferior and therefore violable, and then violating them. And I mean, that's in Richard Dawkins' definition of how we know something is true. If you can make it jump through hoops on command, if you violate it. This is one reason that there are so many rapes. This is one reason there can be no limits to technological progress, because every limit must be violated. This is why it's so important, as I say in Star Trek, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Every limit has to be violated. That's how you define yourself as a man. And by defining blacks as inferior and therefore violable, defining women as inferior and therefore violable, defining salmon as inferior and therefore violable. And there are a bunch of problems with this. One is really nasty. Another problem is that there's a great line by R.D. Laing, how do you plug a void plugging a void? And you can't use a void to plug a void, as every addict knows. If you attempt to use a void to plug a void, you need to keep plugging it because you haven't actually plugged it. And so there's this spiritual hole that keeps getting filled by violations. But one of the problems is that they're not actually filling the hole. Another part of the problem is there's always someone else to violate, which means you can never be satisfied. You never get done.
Worldviews creates worlds is a statement which in many ways is an expression of the law of attraction and the ability for us to manifest from our perception of the world what we get. The ability to manifest the positive destiny of humanity, or perhaps a negative outcome to this tensional place that we're in, is embodied in that statement, where it is not simply my journey that counts. It's a collective journey that counts.
Through our oral tradition, we were foretold in a story, that the white man was going to come. We knew and understood that for thousands of years. And so it was, for the Okanagan, it was no great surprise. And in that story, they were described as a younger brother. We were twins, and the Indian was the older twin. And white man was the younger twin. And that when the younger twin returned, he had certain knowledges, and he was going to bring that knowledge with him. And then at a certain point in time, that, you know, we had to collaborate and get together and work towards preserving this world existence as we know it and experience it at this time. I guess if you really think about it, in many ways it almost seems like a hopeless situation, you know, but we understood that, and we knew that at some point in time that we're going to have to work, you know, with our brother to help preserve not only this land here, but, you know, we're talking about a much bigger picture that is going to have a global impact.
There's another story that talks about two brothers, and that settler people, the settler mindset, I guess if you will, is the little brother. And in that story it talks about how the older brother has to teach the little brother how to live here, because in our stories they tell us how to live here as part of this place. So I guess, you know, thinking about it in that way, there's lots of I guess components of how to really live here that we can bring together in a sustainable manner, so that, you know, we can maintain the integrity of the system.
Here on Vancouver Island, with the 3 different island families that have inhabited this area, a common thread in the stories is being rooted to the land as a form of protection from these floods that are about to occur. So what would happen in many of these stories is large groups of people would gather in canoes, and they would create with the strongest fibers, they would create a rope to anchor themselves to the territory, to the land. And in some cases it was specific trees or landmarks, and the waters would rise. And because they were anchored and connected to the land, after the waters receded, they would still, you know, be able to survive, adapt, and learn from that experience, and life would continue on. And so, of course, today, you know, our way of life has drastically been altered, and it's easy to draw that same analogy to our culture and this devastating wave of colonialism that has impacted our people. And many of our people, our culture, our identity, our language, our spirituality, our foods, the animals and other living beings that share this environment with us have felt the repercussions of this wave of colonialism that has swept over our lands and has wreaked havoc and has transformed and altered it forever.
Again, it's that whole system thinking. People are part of the system. And there's just different ways of how to be a part of that I think need to come together and perpetuate, to create that life and that energy around that kind of thinking. That, you know, just because some people have a PhD, it doesn't mean that they're versed in other areas of life. You know, like there's experts like our elders. They don't go to school, but the things they can tell you about ecology or certain plants or medicines, it's unknown to Western science. Or we've known about it for 10,000 years. Why didn't you just come and ask us?
Well, the cosmology question's pretty complex. First, let's just talk about the next 100 years. I think obviously we've learned that, you know, just putting water back in rivers and taking care of rivers is huge. But for our people, we have to keep the teachings, the language. There's a lot more layers for us. To keep the traditional law upheld, the languages have to be kept alive, and that's a struggle of its own. We have to keep the cultural pedagogy that survived this far intact. That's a struggle of its own, along with the language. The competition for our children's time and ears and hearts now has more distractions than it's ever had before. So that's a struggle of its own, just to have them focus on this, to learn to love this land, to learn to know that this is home, that this is the cradle of their people's existence, and it will take care of them if they know how to live here. It's a big struggle all by itself, separate from what anybody else is doing. That's a big challenge. The other challenge is that we tend to think that the only way that destruction happens when they talk about global warming and climate change is through man-made behaviors. Mother Nature has her own ways of reorganizing things, and those can be cataclysmic.
So as this wave starts to envelop us, or as it's either advancing or receding, it seems as though it pushes some of us to the forefront of the cusp of this wave. And as a result, put it in today's context, many of us who are like-minded, who understand the importance of being connected to land, who understand the importance of being connected with one another and celebrating culture and the uniquenesses and the commonalities, we start to band together, and it's almost as if we're at the forefront of this wave that is a wave of energy that is beyond our control, but is powerful and moves naturally on its own with its own natural ebb and flow. And so without knowing the reasoning or the exact direction that it's taking us in, we're pulled together for a reason. We're pulled together for a purpose. So today we see where we're at, and there's so much atrocity that's occurred. And when you look at the First Nations perspective, the loss of everything for us, essentially, every facet of our way of life we've been deprived of. And not only that, but the environment around us has equally suffered. And so when we try to look at picking up the pieces and where do we start, it almost seems like too daunting of a task. It's overwhelming because there's been so much damage caused, and it continues to happen on a daily basis. But the importance is finding those like-minded people who survived that particular wave or that flood and regroup and reestablish a culture and a way of life that learns from those mistakes and builds upon the successes of our past, as opposed to perpetuating or carrying forward the damaging effects of how our way of life used to be.
Well, we have a lot of scientists who have a lot of expertise, and we have a lot of spiritual prophets who have a lot of visionary abilities. I don't know that all of those people are tapped into what nature itself may do. There are changes, whether they're planetary or lunar or solar, whether they have, lie along fault lines, volcanic eruptions. This is a sleeping giant. And when it wakes up and shakes, we can all pretend we know how it's going to end, but we don't. We don't know that California and the coast of Oregon are always going to be there, that they might not be in the bottom of the ocean floor in a few years. It's not to be doomsday or gloomy, but it's to say that I think we overstate the brilliance of human capacity to predict sometimes. And we should live better. We should take care of one another. We should be more conscientious about how we care for this planet and how we respect it, how we show our respect. But we're not in charge. We're handmaidens. We can be handmaidens of destruction. And we can be part of the salvation, but I wouldn't want to rob the prerogative from the living earth as if I had that knowledge. I don't. I think that's foolish.
The challenge that we're experiencing today is sharing that belief and that philosophy and that way of life with mainstream society, because it goes so much against the grain of what we're taught in the public school system or what we're taught out in mainstream society. In mainstream society, the norm is around individualism and materialism, trying to fend for yourself as opposed to looking out for the well-being of others around you as well. And so our movement is more towards reconnecting with land, reconnecting with self, and reconnecting with the people around us so that we can honor and celebrate and share in the strengths and the qualities and the gifts that we have to offer, as opposed to compete with one another over what we have and what we're accumulating.
It's a waste of energy. It's a waste of time. Who has the biggest car, house, whatever? Do you really need it? Who has the most money? What kind of a measurement is that? It's something you can measure, that's for sure, but you can't buy happiness. You can't buy true sustainability. You can do stuff, but most of the guys that are making the money are not doing it because they feel like they're part of something, or it's because they're extracting the resources, manufacturing something, and drastically changing it into something that might be harmful to the environment, to the water, to the birds. There are some pretty innovative people that have found a way to create wealth. I'm not going to call it success. Create wealth. They may define it as success, but I don't. In enhancing the environment or advocating for the environment. But, it comes back to that question. What's the legacy going to be?
Then people go on to about, solar or wind or, these various kinds of, renewable resources, and it still rests on this industrial platform. So, right now in places like China, there are these just toxic lakes, literally 60 miles big, that are, it's the waste that's left over when they do the mining for the rare earth metals that are needed for things like solar panels and windmills. And it's just as horrible as mountaintop removal or the tar sands. And that's where solar panels come from. You feel like you have to tell people where babies come from. Environmentalists don't want to know this, but this is where solar panels come from. And people there, everybody has pancreatic cancer, because it's just a toxic waste dump, essentially. There's nothing sustainable about wind or solar. You also can't make these things without fossil fuel. The energy required to make them is just vast. How can you mine without using fossil fuel? Has anybody ever been to a mine? They need to go look and see the amount of energy it takes to get things like iron out of the earth, or bauxite, it becomes aluminum. And what they do to those mountains to get it out, and how it destroys the river valleys below and all the people who are trying to live there. It's just vast destruction. So there's on no level can this be done in a sustainable way. There's no fix. Okay, we just have to stop doing it. And I know people don't want to hear that, but ultimately, if you care about this planet, we've got to face the truth in order to move forward and actually, have an impact on how bad this is.
I would say that if we think we can use the mainstream political structures to get out of this problem, or, if we identify most as consumers instead of citizens, or let alone animals who need habitat, our levers are always going to be very short. We're not going to have much leverage in our campaigns for justice. Because corporations and business has been very good recently, as environmentalism has become sort of a fad and a popular thing to do. They've been very good at putting a green veneer over their products and sort of convincing a mass of consumers that by buying their products, they are doing their part to be environmentally friendly and all these other vague terms. But it's not helping the earth. The earth is not better off because of this greenwashing that's been going on. And like I said before, if we trace a lot of the products, whether it's a Toyota Prius or a compact fluorescent light bulb, if we trace all the manufacturing and production and resources that it took to make these things, manufacture them in mass, and distribute them to retailers all over the world, we'll find that it still uses a huge industrial infrastructure that uses oil, that is absolutely unsustainable and immoral because it destroys the land and it destroys creatures' homes.
In this lifetime, what can we do to continue re-educating, to continue understanding the mistakes that we've made within humanity, within all of us? Because we have made some terrible mistakes. Lakes have died. Ecosystems are gone. Some animals and plants are extinct. They'll never come back. We are responsible for that as human beings.
I think in many ways there's some misconceptions about culture that exist today around the separation from one another. And in my perspective, culture is more about the connection to the land than it has to do with, skin color or the language that you speak or whatever the differences may be physically from one another. It has a lot more to do with the foods that we eat, the food systems that we're attached to, the land base that we're attached to. And so, when we look at the realities that we are experiencing today, where many of our food sources are depleted and are almost gone in many cases, and in some cases are extinct already, obviously that's had really adverse effects upon our cultural identity. But so much has changed so suddenly and so rapidly that another misconception that exists, I think, when people are looking at Indigenous society especially, and the revitalization of Indigenous way of life and practices, a misconception that exists is that Indigenous people are striving to return back to a traditional way of life that existed prior to the arrival of Europeans, where the reality is that that way of life, as great as it may be to return to, is not a full possibility for us to return 100% to. Although there are some really great values and principles and philosophies that existed in that way of life that can translate into modern day, the reality is that we share this space today with many other people of many other cultures and walks of life.
The main issue that we're concerned with here at Enauken Center is to find a way to recover our indigeneity. So what does indigeneity mean? For the Syilx people, the Okanagan Indigenous person. And I think one of the approaches and focuses that we are taking is to take it outside of the arena of politics, for instance, political structure. So that also means taking it out of the ethnicity and race constructs that are implicit in that. For instance, in the Indian Act in Canada, it's like tribal organization in the United States. In the Indian Act in Canada, there's some really clear delineations about who an Indian is on a reservation and how they have to be administered to in Canada. So that pretty much is a construct that delineates it on an ethnicity or a race basis. Not so much on a rights basis, because if you look at what Indigenous rights might be as defined by the UN, then those rights are not really considered in the Indian Act or are not implicit in the Indian Act. For instance, my right to indigeneity, what does that mean? If we take it outside of that racist construct and that political construct, then we're left with the idea that it must be a way of living and must be a way of doing things. It must be a way of valuing and organizing around that kind of valuing related to a place.
One of the things that I think is very clear in the U.S. and Canada is that Aboriginal peoples can be legislated out of existence. The Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, is pretty clear on that. All it takes is a stroke of a pen.
If you're looking at it purely from other living things on the earth, if you're going to say those animals are indigenous or those birds are indigenous, what does that actually mean? It has nothing to do with politics or boundaries or the US or Canada or even the United Nations, right? That indigeneity has to do with the way those creatures have adapted to all the conditions in that particular place that they're indigenous to. So climate, terrain, topography, all the other life forms that are there, all are things that they have adapted to and figured out a way to be interdependent with. So if we take that idea and we look at the human being, clearly indigeneity then will have a whole different meaning and a whole different construct.
We're beginning to understand that truth is not absolute, that it's a relational quality, and that law itself, like no matter how carefully you write the laws, they're always open to interpretation, and the solution isn't necessarily to add even more details to the laws. But we're beginning to understand that law is a story. It's interpretations that whose meaning depends on everything that's happening in society. So I think that this kind of legal fundamentalism is becoming a bit obsolete. And we've, ascended to, in our fantasies, to become the lords and masters of nature, but things haven't gotten any better. So I think we need a much deeper kind of revolution, where we're letting go of control and we're trusting in things to emerge. We're trusting in co-creative processes.
And so I'm, rather than being pessimistic of the future, I really look forward to the future with hope, because I see that as challenging and as hard and difficult as things may be or seemingly are, it can only get easier. And for First Nations peoples, we've suffered and endured for a very long time, and we've, with a lot of humility, have learned to be persistent. We've learned to be very resilient. And so now, as things are seemingly falling apart, it seems like an ideal time for us to step forward and to lead the way into a way of life that is more appropriate for us that share this land together, to reconnect, to repair some of the damages with the land, to repair some of the damages that have been caused to us. And so it's definitely a very interesting time.
How can we reflect that without looking at some of the ideas in governance, without looking at some of the ideas in religious practice, for instance, or in social practices that deal with education or economics? All of those areas would be impacted and affected by, if the fundamental bottom line was we have to somehow become interdependent so that nature itself can regenerate at 100% with us being present, with us being part of that.
And when you have a relationship with the land, when you have a relationship with a system, conflict is a very important part of that relationship. Conflict is critical because what conflict does is it establishes change. It defines boundaries. It sets the perimeters for what that relationship is. That's what conflict does. That's what conflict teaches us as human beings.
The idea that we're all looking for in sustainability and all these other measures, we have to create a bottom line. And that bottom line is a rigid line and is related to specific places, local areas that operate in different ways. So for instance, the response to the landscape in the climate like the Okanagan would be very different than, say, West Coast rainforest. So the way that the human has to respond and the things that they have to know and the institutions that they have to teach the succeeding generations how to respond appropriately to that particular place would have to be different. That's what creates culture. Marie Batiste and Henderson and others have spoken about Indigenous knowledge not being about culture in the anthropological sense, but a response to specific places. And that's what Indigenous knowledge is. So looking at indigeneity from that point of view suggests that it's not about the requirement being living in a place for a long time, although that's what has evolved it and developed it. but it can mean also finding new ways in a shorter amount of time to be able to implement that. So does that mean that others can practice that social paradigm? Yes, of course it does. So we need those new kinds of constructs that help everyone to be more indigenous to the places they're occupying and living in and affecting.
One of our natural laws is salmon. One of our unspoken, unwritten traditional laws is the law of the salmon. Salmon gave his body to sustain our people, and we, in kind, owe him his home and his habitat and his life. And so to restore species of fish, regardless of the scientific wars about which fish, is a big deal. And to bring rivers back to life is a big deal. To take roads, as one of our elders here used to say, to take roads out of river bottoms and railroads out of river bottoms and restore river bottoms, the aquifer as well as the surface water, has huge consequences and benefits to everything that lives here. So how we've become separated from it, and where we have to get back to, is stop thinking about it as a commodity, stop thinking about water as a resource to be managed and used for our purposes versus a living thing that has a right of its own to exist and to travel and to breathe and shape itself and its future. And so if you think about all of these living beings as relatives instead of as resources, perhaps we'd behave differently.
We've been hearing for a century now that if we don't do something for salmon, that they're going to go extinct. And I think if you take an honest approach to the question, by all rights, if you look at how we've treated our rivers and our lands, those prognosticators should be right. Salmon shouldn't be here, but it's a testament to their strength and their endurance and their ability to survive that they're still with us, and we owe them a debt of gratitude.
If we look at who would be opposed to a bioregion, if we look at who's going to be quote unquote negatively impacted by a bioregional awareness movement, it's only those who seek to exploit the earth in a manner which is not in sync with what we need to do. And at the same time, I do want to embrace them somehow. I do want to give their concerns and their cares credence. And yet, as an expression of what is possible for humans to do together, bioregions offer a huge opportunity for us to model something that works. It's like, we know that this other way has not worked. We don't know exactly what's going to work, but each step towards that is a positive step. It does involve stepping away from a system. And if you just look at who's most opposed to the step that you're seeking to take, it tells you a lot about the step you're seeking to take. The movement into a more localized regional autonomous economy is not separative in the human sense. It's only separate in the economic sense. And that cannot be the driver for us.
Quite recent in our history as First Nations peoples, we've become separated through provincial and national boundaries that have been placed from colonial governments as opposed to the people that are actually living on the land. And so Nuu-chah-nulth people, Coast Salish people, our territories expand across international boundaries. And so the concept of putting an invisible line to divide one section of our people from another is quite a bizarre concept that doesn't fit with our traditional way of life, of course. And when we look at it, the geographical separations that have occurred through boundaries are reflective of a lot of other boundaries and barriers that have been put in place by these governments as well. There's social barriers that are not as visible, but definitely we, as First Nations peoples, we felt the social barriers that were put into place. There's economic barriers and cultural barriers that are also in place. And so the divisive approach of governments to divide our people into different sections, to compete against one another, to be bickering with one another, has only been effective for the governments with their agenda to take the resources as opposed to create unity. From an Indigenous perspective, it makes a lot more sense to, if there's division of land, that it's based upon the bioregion as opposed to just political lines that are drawn arbitrarily on a map.
Yeah, a lot of people are scared of the transition with good reason, because we're really stepping into new territory and it's scary. How do you prepare? How do you, even if what you care about is security for yourself and your family, how do you prepare against the unknown when nothing that is secure today has any guarantee of persisting into the future? Like, how do you prepare? So one thing I talk about is, how do you prepare when any investment isn't safe? And even gold, even physical gold wouldn't be safe because someone could come and take it. Like, how do you prepare? Where does real security come from? I think that certainly one kind of security that is actually secure more than anything else is relationships. So if you are valuable to the people around you, and if you've been giving a lot to the people around you, then you create this reservoir of gratitude. People will want to take care of you too. So I think that, even from this kind of survivalist mentality, your underground bunker isn't going to do it. Even if you're just a survivalist, you got to say, well, I've got to build relationships. I've got to build community. I've got to get used to taking care of each other. And coincidentally enough, this preparation for collapse is the very same thing that's going to make the collapse less scary. Because if people are taking care of each other and relying on each other, then we're going to come through it okay. It's not going to be this kind of war of all against all, this resource war you're talking about, if we enter a different mindset, which is totally possible. I mean, we really have plenty of resources to live very beautifully on Earth. We don't need, almost all of the resources that we use today don't even contribute to human happiness. So it's not a matter of not enough resources. I think that's kind of a bogeyman, Resource wars only happen if we're trying to maintain the status quo. But once we give up on the status quo, then there's no reason to have resource wars because we live in abundance, this underlying abundance that is masked by the money system, which causes scarcity.
What does everybody in the world want? Satisfaction. How do we shift that so that it creates that satisfaction of doing something, of maintaining some traditions or laws or ethics, creating or maintaining relationships, or making something new, being open to just making a contribution so that we have a complete system. Because back to that perspective on ecology, you can't separate one element. Otherwise, the system is flawed, or the ecosystem is weakened because of the removal or altercation of things in that system. And we are a part of that system. We're not separate from it. We don't live on Mars yet. We still live here. We still drink this water. We still need this water. The fish need it. The animals need it. The plants need it. Our kids need it.
One of the things that our people believe in and rely on is the ability to step out into the unknown and to be clear that we're stepping out into the unknown, meaning that we can take risks, and we have to take risks to make changes happen. When we know that something here isn't working or something here is preventing us from moving toward a better direction. And I think that when you're talking about the idea of Cascadia, for instance, that idea is an idea. The idea, in terms of its concept, in terms of its meaning, might be understood or theorized or might be believed in, but what are the actions that are putting it in place in a practical, in an everyday way? What are those things that people are willing to do and take a risk to do to make happen? And I think in a lot of ways, the idea, for me, has a lot to do with finding a way to create that kind of common ground and common place with the indigenous peoples, and finding a way to be able to work with them and through them to be able to establish practical ground in that area. So it means then it has to relate to the fish, it has to relate to the forest, it has to relate to nature in its various ways of interaction and interdependence with the indigenous people. So what does that mean? It means finding out. It means talking to them, and it means supporting some of the things that they're involved in, but supporting it in a way which says, we're supporting this because it is foundational to establishing Cascadia. We are supporting this because it's foundational to the idea of what Cascadia is. And so that it's always creating that parallel in that way and making no mistakes about that part and making no mistakes about what Cascadia is in terms of its reality, right? So it can't be just a theory, in other words. It has to be real things on the ground that get highlighted and get established as standards for what Cascadia is.
You know, there's a great book about this written by Paul Hawken called Blessed Unrest. And towards the end of it, he writes something to the effect, I think I can actually quote it verbatim. He says, "It'll be the stroke of midnight for the rest of our lives." We're in the midst of a crisis, and people are responding in unprecedented ways because the crisis that we're up against is unprecedented. And so I think you'll continue to see these innovative and creative alignments of movements that up until now haven't spent a lot of time talking to one another or planning with one another. And unfortunately, I think you'll also see people that have managed to accrue a lot of wealth and power clinging, you know, more desperately, more ruthlessly to what they have. What an interesting time to be alive. I mean, there's no need to write a science fiction novel about some huge looming crisis facing a planet, because we're kind of in the midst of one right now.
Now we're looking at the relationship with the earth. How do we say, no, this is not acceptable? What are the means that we have to take as human beings to say, this is our line, and this is what we're not willing to bargain with anymore? And I think as humanity evolves and grows, I think that that's a very healthy thing. I think that's, if the forefathers said that that's what they fought for was democracy, then true democracy is saying no. We protect this ecosystem because it's all of ours. So is it criminalized? Are people being called criminals because they're practicing their right to say no, to protect a beautiful, pristine ecosystem so that their children can have healthy food and all of society can understand this living organism like Cascadia? You know, that's the question to be asked there, is to not criminalize the behaviors of things that are utterly beautiful to create change. there is a greater cause than myself, and there's a greater being than myself. And I think that there is more and more people within society that are seeing that and the importance of that, and looking at that from academics to grassroots people to families that are saying, no, we're scared, and they should be.
So for people who are trying to build and live in a community of resistance, I would suggest that they think about two things every day, one of which is the past and one of which is the future. So about the past, remember that you're part of a tradition. You know, sometimes it feels like we're alone, but we're not. We belong to a long and proud tradition of resistance against empire, against oppression of all kinds. And we have to, to honor that memory, that it informs how we struggle. We can learn strategy and tactics from those people in history. And it also, for me, it changes how I think about things and the level of risk that I'm willing to take on, to know that people have fought back under the most terrible situations imaginable, under the most depressive circumstances, have continued to fight. And for me, that's an inspiration that I take every day from history. And then, of course, we have to think about the future, because if we're not able to build successful cultures of resistance, if we can't build successful resistance movements, then the future is very dim. One of the reasons that the civil rights movement was so successful, that people were willing to take risks, was because they were thinking about their children, because they were thinking about generations to come. And I think that if we're going to take the kind of action, if we're going to take the kind of risks we need as people and as a movement, then we have to understand that we're not just dealing with short-term risk to ourselves. We're dealing with risk to the whole planet, to the future of life on this planet. And that I'm willing to risk going to jail. I'm willing to risk, getting arrested or persecuted or injured or even killed if it will help this planet. But I'm not willing to risk, the end of life as we know it.
If you look in the grand scheme of things, we're gonna fight these battles, and we may well lose. That whole victory or defeat dichotomy is another sort of ultimately not very meaningful human construct, because in the out here in the biological world, 80% of organisms, 90% of organisms, probably more, also fail. And so the whole Tom Robbins quote, it's questionable whether success is an adequate response to life. Instead, pick something that means a lot to you and run with it.
If you look at the way the land actually works to support processes at a broader scale, there are systematic regularities to the way, say, water flows downhill, the way sediment flows down here, where fish spawn, where fish eat. And if you start laying on those kind of physical and biological realities onto a landscape, it turns out that there's certain places that can actually support biologic activity, like fish production. And there's places where if we do certain things, we can actually damp that down. And so rethinking land use along some of the big valley bottoms, I think, is one sort of long-term imperative if we want to bring back a very local, very efficient, both ecologically and financially, mechanism of food production, salmon. It's one of the best foods there is on the planet. And yet right now you walk into a store in Seattle this time of year, you're probably buying salmon from Alaska. This used to be one of the biggest salmon producing regions in the world. Why are we buying our fish from Alaska? Well, because we've squandered the fish that we had here.
The sort of baseline condition of these rivers until 100 years ago was just this massive amount of biological wealth and diversity. And what we did unknowingly for a large segment of that time was to do away with that wealth. I think by removing dams, what we have is a storyline that tells us we can have some of that back. We may not be able to get all of it back, but here's a huge step that we can take that's doable, that's immediate, that will give our children and grandchildren something they can pin their hopes on for a long time to come. And it's a great story, and here we are, you know, on the banks of a river telling it, hoping that other people will hear.
You know, when you go on a fast for 4 days, you know, without food or water, you know, you come to understand pretty fast, you know, the sacredness of water. I mean, it's one thing to sit here and be able to say, oh, water's sacred. Oh, water is a very important natural element. It's just word of mouth, you know, it's rhetoric. But to truly understand that, and to know that water is a gift, and it's, you know, it's a powerful resource, and it has a spirit to it that keeps our spirit alive. You know, and you come to understand that, you look at it differently.
Something that hasn't had water for 15 or 20 years, water comes by, it can create that kind of life after that period of dormancy. And there ain't anything else in the world that can do that. I could tell you guys lots of stories about water, but you know, it's that powerful and it's that sacred. And it should be for all of us, because, you know, it's important. Important to be able to drink water. You think fighting for money and oil is bad? Doesn't even come close.
It's not just an evolution of our doctrines and an evolution of our actual structures. It's actually an evolution within ourselves. So it's about tuning into cycles. It's about tuning into the earth. It's about allowing things that are dying to die. That's something that we haven't really been able to do for a long time. Our society seems to be developed to the extent of holding on to these structures. And it's so similar in so many ways to the time of Copernicus, where the biggest opponents to the new way of looking at the world that he proposed were patriarchal, dogmatic, powerful people who had a lot to lose, they thought, if people embraced the idea that the earth revolves around the sun. And at the same time, who is actually going to be harmed by our embracing of our own ability to manifest the world that we want? How could that harm anyone? And yet it does involve allowing some structures, some dogmas, and some things to die.
I used to think that cynicism was a form of cowardice. It's saying, like, I don't want to care too much about anything. But later I became less judgmental. And, you know, I don't think anybody's fundamentally a coward. I think really what's happening is that it hurts so much that we withdraw into cynicism and give up hope. And so to the cynic, the person who is naively hopeful, that's actually really triggering because it touches this little speck of hope that's still actually there. And when that is touched, the pain of repeated betrayals and persecution and being kept small becomes all the more intense. So for the cynic, sometimes I have nothing to say. Sometimes I might say, you know, that little speck in you that believes naively that a more beautiful world is possible, like, that's true. Your secret suspicion was true, and it's still alive.
Because we live in a modern day culture that sucks that life and that passion out of us wherever we turn. So there's that aspect of it, and I think another aspect that will help with that will be very complementary to building the spirit of resistance is to identify with Cascadia itself, to start identifying with the bioregion. Learn about plants, simple things like taking walks outside with a plant guide. Learn about who lives with you, learn about your plant neighbors and your animal neighbors. And, help yourself to love where you live, because you will fight to defend what you love. And we need that now more than ever.
We have a number of identities that sort of ripple outward, and the first is really as beings in a universe that's alive, and it's our connection to the cosmos. And that's, I think, the most important one, because that's our spiritual health and our spiritual connection. And that often comes through our connection to the land, because the land is what gives us life. So in order to really have that connection to the cosmos, I think you kind of have to go through the land. Everything alive is in a process of transformation. We're either feeding or being fed, the other creatures that are around us. Almost every single rock on the planet was once part of a living creature. And then, the oceans dry up and the tectonic plates shift and the ocean floor becomes exposed. It turns into land again, and then it's taken up by living creatures again. So most of the molecules on this planet have been through that process multiple times, which is to say that we're all made of this earth, and the earth is made of us. And we're all one cell in space. We're one living organism. So in order to have that spiritual connection to that sort of vaster realm of the cosmos, I think it's just got to go through the land, because that's where the transformation is, that's where the mystery is, and that's where those moments of life and death and rebirth and regeneration, that's where it all begins. That's why we're alive. So that's why I think the land is so important. And I think the cultures that really were able to be sustainable long term knew that, and they knew how to be humble participants. And industrial civilization has certainly lost that connection, and pretty profoundly. So in order to have any chance of this region surviving, of this continent surviving with any life on it, the planet as a whole surviving as a living being, we are going to have to remember the places that we live and learn how to participate again inside those living communities.
Channelizing the rivers, the big river, has huge consequences. Those big monoliths of concrete are not the prettiest thing I've ever seen. But our people, one of our elders who passed away last year used to tell a story about Coyote when someone built a dam downriver a long time ago. And they were doing it to catch fish instead of using a fish weir and nets. And so they built a little artificial dam out of rocks and wood. And Coyote went down, and it's a very long Coyote story where Coyote turns himself into a baby, and the women who are running that camp, who are going out digging every day from that camp right near the dam, put him in a cradle board and hang him on a tree and leave him in camp, and then they go out and dig, and then they come back. And every day he would get out of the cradle board and take a little bit of the dam apart. Every day. A little, rock here, a stone there, and a piece of wood or a stick. And then he'd get back into his cradle board and they'd come back to camp. Until one day, on the fifth day, a woman's digging stick broke, and she thought, there must be something wrong. I better go check on the baby. And she went back to camp and she checked on the baby board, and there was no one in it. And there was Coyote taking the last big rock out of that dam, and the water started to run. And the salmon were able to get back up as a consequence. And she cried out to her sisters that he was taking the dam apart, and that he wasn't a baby at all, he was Coyote. And so our elder, who passed away, she said, oh, we're just waiting for Coyote to come back. And so we don't know how long that'll take. We're not without hope.